Now, I'm going to ask Stewart Lockie, who is the Director of the Cairns Institute, to say a few words in closing, but then I'm going to ask our two co-hosts to come up and make a few closing comments. But Stewart.
It's a strange moment in the conference to be welcoming you to the Cairns Institute, but as the Director of the Institute, I would like to welcome you and to express my hope that you've had a very productive 2 days. I was asked in giving a closing address to try and summarise some of the main themes, and of course that always becomes a rather fraught exercise when so many things are discussed. What I'm going to try and do, rather than summarise everything, is pick a few points that particularly stuck in my mind and to identify some challenges that I think are worth thinking about as we attempt to move forward. I'd particularly like to encourage you, I think, to paraphrase Comla somewhat, to continue thinking about the question of what development is all about, to think about what ought to be developed and why and for whom it ought to be developed. I don't wish to comment in any detail on the additional 2% growth target that the Australian government is encouraging the G20 leaders to adopt through the G20 meetings. But I do want to challenge all of us as members of the business and the academic and the non-profit sectors to think about when we put those sorts of when we work within those larger regulatory and policy settings established by government, how we as individuals and as members of institutions and as professional collectives of various kinds operationalise those settings and act within them. I also want to encourage you or challenge you to take a more cosmopolitan worldview, because one of the things that I often say as Director of the Cairns Institute, and I've lived all over Australia, I should say I've lived all up and down the eastern seaboard of Australia. I've never gone much further west. I think Wagga's as far west as I've ever gone for any length of time. I like to say that in far north Queensland we're not parochial. The rest of Australia thinks far north Queenslanders are parochial. We're not parochial. We're actually more cosmopolitan than they are. We just don't care much about the south of Australia. We're looking northward to the world. But I think sometimes it's a challenge for us to remind the rest of Australia that they need to regard us with more cosmopolitan eyes, and I think sometimes it's a challenge for us to think about what a cosmopolitan worldview really means. Now, let me put a bit of meat on those particular bones. Most speakers have mentioned the State of the Tropics report, and a lot of people have referred to some of the findings in relation to economic growth, which, not surprisingly, show that throughout the tropical band, a lot of the growth has been concentrated in Southeast Asia, to a lesser extent in South Asia, and that growth is associated with the lifting of people out of poverty. It's associated with the beginnings of a transition from extractive economies to service-based economies, and it's also associated with deteriorating environmental quality. None of that will be a great surprise. We want to be really careful, though, about what we read into some of those associations. The Asian Development Bank released a report very recently, in the last couple of months, looking at progress in the Asia-Pacific in dealing with poverty. Now, the ADB researchers were motivated by the perception within the international development community that the poverty issue in Asia is under control and the world's attention needs to be focused on other parts of the world. Now, they don't question the need for a focus on other parts of the world, but they ask the question, well, is poverty really under control in Asia? I remember sitting in a workshop in Yangon the day after the State of the Tropics report was released, and in our discussion group we asked the question, well, when we use that $1.25 a day indicator of absolute poverty, millions of people within the tropical region have been lifted out of poverty. But what if we set the bar at $1.50? what would happen? What if we set the bar at $2? What would happen? We all know that if you're trying to live in Australia, you'd be struggling. Trying to live in parts of Papua New Guinea where people live a much more subsistence-based economy, it may be less of a big deal. Well, the ADB researchers actually were simultaneously picking up on exactly the same question and asking what a reasonable poverty level for Asia Pacific should be and what happens. So if we look at the $1.25 mark, what we would say is that in 1981 there were 1.6 billion people in Asia Pacific living in absolute poverty and only 700 million today. A tremendous win. 900 million people lifted out of absolute poverty. If we set the bar at $1.51, which they determined to be more reasonable based on the actual cost of living across the region, they calculated that 1.75 billion people today live in poverty within the Asia Pacific. In other words, no net improvement. They also estimated that if income inequality had remained static rather than deepening during that period, an additional 240 million people would have been lifted out of poverty. Economic growth is critical to dealing with many of the issues of poverty alleviation throughout the tropical world, but we need to be very careful about assuming that growth by itself, that development by itself, achieves the main game, which is not just about better living standards on average, but better living standards for those people who really need them. Deepening inequality, income polarisation, is the absolute enemy of achieving the main purpose of development. I'm a comfortable middle-class person, and like everybody else, I worry about my debts, I worry about my mortgage, I wonder if we should buy a new car, and I do all of those things. It's a completely different world to the people who live in the slums of Manila and other parts of the tropical belt where poverty is concentrated. One of the most striking comments, though, I have to say, over the last 2 days came from Hugh, when about 2/3 of the way through your talk, in looking at the growth trajectories of various countries throughout the tropical region, you said the Philippines. The Philippines, for goodness sake. I hope I haven't, hammed up your inflection too much. I spent a lot of time in the Philippines, and I especially, because I thought I'd mention this today, I wore my latest Philippine shirt today. I can't show you pictures of really high-quality architecture in Quezon City. I think my parents-in-law live in a terrible house in Quezon City. It's concrete, it's hot as hell, and full of dengue mosquitoes. But we spent a lot of time there, and my wife has a master's degree from the US. She's educated at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and the people we know come from all walks of life, but the people we know best are professionals, they're architects, they're financiers, they're software engineers. All of them do business internationally. Now, what's my point here? My point here relates to that issue about cosmopolitanism. It's a little bit of a shame we didn't get the chance to ask too many questions of elected leaders, but, it would be probably a good heading on for a decade that Queensland state-level politicians have been talking about the need to export Queensland's knowledge of the tropical world out to the region. We need to be very careful in assuming that the rest of the tropical world needs us to export our knowledge. When we look at some of our partners in the State of the Tropics project, we see world-class universities, and some of them recognised amongst the most highly ranked universities in the world. When I look at my own circle of friends, I see people who can work anywhere in the world. These are people we need to be working in partnership with, not assuming are a bunch of dumb Asians or dumb Pacific Islanders who desperately need our help. As a wealthy country in the region, we do have a lot of responsibility to be helping people, but we won't achieve it by maintaining some sort of colonial, dare I say, racist mindset. We'll only do it by entering into genuine partnerships with people out in the region. When we look at the growth trajectory of the countries as highlighted in a number of the presentations, I would say this isn't just our responsibility to ourselves, our responsibility to our neighbours. I would say in the long term it's our responsibility to our children and our grandchildren, because we want to be riding in the slipstream of these countries. The future of the world is very much tied up with what's going on in the tropics, and the future for us in Northern Australia will be very closely tied up in our linkages into the rest of the tropical world, and we need to embrace those with a very mature, cosmopolitan and partnership-based perspective. I will leave it there, and I believe that Sandra and Bob. Thanks, Kerry.
Nicely provocative way to round it out. Thank you, Stewart.